Picture this: the grand hall of a medieval castle, alive with flickering torchlight and the low hum of noble chatter. At the center of it all, a figure in motley leaps and tumbles, his bells jingling with every exaggerated gesture. The court erupts in laughter, but beneath the painted grin, his sharp eyes miss nothing. This jester isn't just a fool, he's a spy, a confidant, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room. Welcome to the secret lives of court jesters, where the line between clown and kingmaker was razor thin, and the truth was often hidden behind a mask of laughter. For centuries, jesters have been dismissed as mere entertainers, relegated to the footnotes of history as comic relief. But what if I told you these colorful characters wielded power that even knights and nobles envied? They moved through the shadows of royal courts, eavesdropping on whispered conspiracies, delivering coded messages, and even steering the fate of kingdoms with a well-timed joke. Some were trusted advisors, whispering truths to kings who would hear them from no one else. Others were masters of disguise, using their antics to expose corruption or smuggle secrets under the guise of folly. Behind the jingling hats and exaggerated pratfalls lay minds as sharp as any diplomat's and ambitions just as deadly. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on history's most misunderstood figures. From scandalous affairs that toppled dynasties to political games played with a fool's grin, the world of court jesters was anything but childish. How did a class of entertainers gain such unprecedented access to the powerful? Why were they allowed to speak truths that would cost anyone else their head? And what dark secrets did they carry to their graves? Strap in, because this isn't the fairy tale version of history you were taught. This is the untold story of the jesters who shaped the medieval world, one laugh at a time. Long before jesters danced in medieval courts with their jingling caps and barbed wit, their ancestors walked among kings and commoners alike in even older civilizations. The tradition of the royal fool stretches back thousands of years, from the Roman Morians who mocked emperors to their faces, to the Celtic bards who could destroy a warlord's reputation with a single satirical verse. These early entertainers weren't just comedians, they were keepers of oral history, spiritual guides, and crucially, truth-tellers who could speak where others dared not. Take the Celtic bards, for example. In ancient Ireland and Wales, these poets held staggering influence. Their words could bless a king's reign or curse him into obscurity. A bard's satire wasn't just mockery, it was a weapon sharper than any sword, capable of stripping a ruler of allies and legitimacy overnight. Kings feared their tongues but also needed their approval, creating a delicate dance of power where humor and survival intertwined. Similarly, in tribal societies across Europe and Asia, shamans often wore the dual mask of healer and trickster. They communicated with spirits through riddles and jest, using absurdity to reveal hidden truths. Their rituals blurred the line between sacred and profane, much like the later jesters who could criticize a king's policies one moment and perform a bawdy song the next. But how did these diverse roles crystallize into the familiar figure of the medieval court jester? The answer lies in the shifting politics of power. As kingdoms centralized, rulers needed insiders who could navigate the treacherous waters of court life. Someone who could listen without seeming to, jest without offending, and whisper warnings disguised as nonsense. Unlike nobles bound by rigid protocol, jesters moved freely, their antics giving them license to cross boundaries no advisor could. By the 12th century, jesters had cemented their place as fixtures in royal households, their privileges unparalleled. They dined at the king's table, traveled with his entourage, and often held the ear of power in ways even generals envied. Their immunity wasn't just tolerance, it was law. In some kingdoms, harming a jester carried harsher penalties than harming a noble, because a fool's loyalty was seen as pure, untainted by land or title. Yet this protection came at a price. For every jester who retired to a comfortable old age, countless others vanished into the footnotes of history, silenced when their jokes cut too close to the bone, or sacrificed as pawns in games they were supposed to merely observe. The same laughter that shielded them could vanish in an instant, leaving only the echo of bells where a daring truth-teller once stood. Imagine living in a time where one wrong word could cost you your head unless, of course, you wore bells on your hat. The court jester's immunity wasn't just a quirky medieval privilege. It was a carefully crafted loophole in a world where free speech was a death wish. While nobles bowed and schemed, jesters could call the king a fool to his face and live to joke about it. Their unique status wasn't accidental, it was a calculated tool of power. Take the legendary case of Raher, jester to England's King Henry I. When the king's taxes bled the poor dry, Raher didn't just hint at injustice, he staged an entire mock funeral for the king's greed, parading a coffin labeled Common Mercy through the court. Any other man would have been hanged for treason, but Raher's antics forced Henry to actually reform his policies. This wasn't just comedy, it was political theater with real consequences. What gave jesters this extraordinary license? The answer lies in the concept of licensed foolery. Medieval rulers understood that unchecked power bred blindness, so they kept jesters as living mirrors, reflecting their flaws through laughter. A jester's barbs were tolerated because they served a vital function, exposing truths too dangerous for anyone else to voice. The church had its confessors, but kings had their fools, both absolving sins, one with prayer, the other with punchlines. Their access was staggering. While ministers waited for audiences, jesters breezed into royal chambers unannounced. They ate from the king's plate, slept in palace corridors, and traveled with the royal retinue, privileges even high-ranking nobles envied. In some courts, jesters carried engraved badges that granted them entry anywhere, a medieval all-access pass. This wasn't mere favoritism, it was strategic. A ruler surrounded by yes-men needed one person who'd seen the kitchens, the barracks, and the back alleys, then distilled those truths into coded jests. But immunity had its limits. The wise jester knew which lines couldn't be crossed. When France's King Charles VI descended into madness, his jester, Jehan, walked a razor's edge, mocking the court's chaos while secretly steering decisions to prevent collapse. Yet jesters who misjudged their rulers' moods faced grim ends. The Spanish jester Borra made one quip too many about Queen Isabella's weight and found himself banished to a monastery, a warning that even fools weren't untouchable. Perhaps the most shocking privilege, some jesters acted as royal spies. Portugal's King John II used his jester, Jorge, as a diplomatic courier, smuggling sealed letters in his motley during tense negotiations with Castile. Who would suspect the bumbling fool of carrying state secrets? Behind the laughter, these were men and occasionally women, who wielded influence most courtiers could only dream of, all while the crowd roared at their tumbles. Their greatest power, though, wasn't in what they said but what they heard. Jesters were the original flies on the wall, invisible in plain sight. When the Earl of Warwick plotted against England's Edward IV, it was his own jester who whispered the conspiracy to the king, disguised as a riddle about a fox in the henhouse. That's the paradox of the jester's role. The very people who laughed at them often forgot they could listen and remember. They called it the privilege of folly, but for many jesters, that motley costume was the perfect disguise for a far more dangerous game. Behind the pratfalls and puns, jesters operated as the medieval world's most unconventional spies, their laughter masking a razor-sharp awareness of every whispered conspiracy in the castle. While nobles dueled with swords, jesters fought with wit, turning their role as court clowns into the ultimate cover for intelligence gathering. Consider the story of Triboulet, the infamous jester of France's King Louis XII. While tumbling and juggling for the court, he'd linger just a moment too long near huddled noblemen, memorizing fragments of treasonous talk, his greatest coup. overhearing a plot to assassinate the king, which he revealed not with a solemn report, but by stumbling into the throne room shrieking about rats in the walls chewing the royal banners. The coded warning gave Louis enough time to thwart the attack, all while Triboulet played the fool. This wasn't isolated theatrics, it was systemic. Jesters had three critical advantages as spies. First, their mobility. Unlike guards or servants bound to specific posts, jesters wandered everywhere from wine cellars to war councils. Second, their perceived harmlessness, who would guard their tongue around someone the court saw as a living toy. And third, their art of misdirection. A well-timed pratfall could cover a stolen glance at confidential papers, while a bawdy song might distract guards during a clandestine meeting. The Spanish court took this shadow play to chilling extremes. During the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Jester Perico served as their personal intelligence network. Dispatched to suspect noble households under the guise of entertaining, he'd return with detailed reports hidden in the hollow bells of his hat, on who drank too much, who cursed the crown, and who might be conspiring with foreign powers. His most famous exploit, unmasking a group of nobles planning to defect to Portugal by accidentally mixing up their coats at a feast and discovering incriminating letters in the pockets. But the stakes were deadly. For every jester who played the spy successfully, others paid the ultimate price. In 15th century Bohemia, the jester Markov was caught slipping coded notes between rebel factions. His punishment, forced to perform his own execution, ordered to juggle knives until he slipped. The message was clear: a jester's immunity lasted only as long as their usefulness. What made them willing to risk it? Some sought power, others protection, but many genuinely believed in their role as the kingdom's conscience. The best jesters walked a razor's edge, making rulers laugh while secretly keeping them honest. When England's Richard III began confiscating lands from political enemies, his jester Coll staged a mock auction of the crown jewels, cackling that, since all's fair in theft, why stop at titles? The stunned silence that followed forced Richard to moderate his excesses, proof that even kings could be checked by a fool's courage. Their legacy lingers in modern intelligence tactics. Like jesters, today's undercover agents often adopt exaggerated personas to deflect suspicion. The difference: medieval jesters did it without backup, armed only with quick wits and the desperate hope that their next joke wouldn't be their last. Among the parade of jesters who danced through history's courts, a few names ring out like the clash of their own bells, figures who turned their role into legend. Take Triboulet, the razor-tongued jester who served two French kings. When Francois I accidentally struck him during a rage, Triboulet didn't cower. He demanded the king grant him the right to strike back one time whenever he chose. Francois, amused, agreed. Years later, as the king bent to tie his shoe, Triboulet slapped his rear, declaring the debt paid. The court gasped, but Francois roared with laughter. That was the jester's genius, wrapping rebellion in absurdity, making even kings play by his rules. Then there's Sommers, Henry VIII's most trusted fool, and perhaps his only honest friend. While advisors flattered the volatile king, Sommers mocked Henry's ego, his marriages, even his waistline. When Henry dissolved the monasteries, Sommers staged a puppet show where a king gobbled up tiny churches, stuffing them into his pockets. The message was clear, but the delivery kept his head on his shoulders. Their bond ran deep. Legend says Sommers was the only one who could calm Henry's infamous temper, once stopping an execution by whispering a joke in the king's ear at the scaffold. But no jester cut deeper than Scotland's Archibald Armstrong, whose tongue was as sharp as his wits. Serving James I, Armstrong insulted everyone from bishops to foreign ambassadors, once telling the Spanish envoy his breath smelled like heresy and bad diplomacy. When censured, he shot back, "Why muzzle the fool when the whole court barks lies?" His downfall came when he mocked James' son, Charles I, a fatal misstep that got him banished. Yet even in exile, Armstrong published a scathing tell-all, proving jesters weren't just court ornaments. They were historians, critics, and sometimes the only voices daring to speak truth to power. What set these jesters apart wasn't just their wit, but their uncanny ability to navigate the knife's edge between loyalty and subversion. They weren't merely clowns, they were master psychologists reading their rulers like open books. Triboulet knew Francois prized cleverness over decorum. Sommers understood Henry's loneliness beneath the bluster. Armstrong recognized James' vanity masked insecurity. Their foolishness was, in truth, a finely tuned instrument, playing on the very insecurities and desires their masters tried to hide. The most fascinating twist. Some of history's most famous jesters may never have existed. The beloved jester Roland the Farter, said to have been granted lands by Henry II for his ability to leap, whistle, and fart simultaneously, likely sprang from satirical ballads mocking royal excess. Yet even these fictional fools reveal a deeper truth. Jesters embodied the public's hunger for anyone who could prick the pomposity of power. Real or imagined, their stories endure because they represent the eternal fantasy of speaking truth without consequences, of laughing in the face of tyrants and walking away unscathed. Behind every legend, though, lies a darker reality. For every jester who retired rich, dozens vanished without a trace, their fates erased like a poorly received joke. The ones we remember were the exceptions, not the rule. Their survival depended on a precarious alchemy of timing, talent, and sheer luck. Misjudge a king's mood by half a breath, and the bells on your hat might be the last sound you ever hear. But for every jester who mastered the art of survival, countless others learned the hard way that royal laughter could turn deadly in an instant. The same privileges that shielded them, the right to mock, to eavesdrop, to speak truths disguised as jests, also made them targets. One misjudged punchline about a queen's infidelity or a duke's failed battle could transform a court favorite into a corpse before the echo of their bells faded. History remembers the jesters who thrived, but archives whisper of those who didn't. In 1582, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II's jester was hanged after a satire comparing the imperial court to a brothel. No trial, no pardon, just a snapped neck and a warning scribbled in the margins of a ledger. These weren't isolated incidents. Jesters lived under a brutal calculus. The more power they wielded, the higher the stakes. A noble's insult might earn a fine or brief exile, but a jester's misstep often ended at the executioner's block. The threats weren't just from rulers. Jesters faced venomous rivalries with courtiers who resented their access. Nobles plotted against them, servants spat in their food, and rival entertainers, minstrels, acrobats saw them as competitors for royal favor. The jester of Sweden's Queen Christina once survived 3 poisoning attempts in a single year, all traced to a nobleman furious over losing lands to the Queen's foolish advisor. Then there was the psychological toll, always performing, always assessing the room's mood. It was a relentless tightrope walk. Some jesters cracked under the strain. The diary of an anonymous Venetian jester describes nights spent rehearsing jokes in mirrors, obsessing over every syllable. Too bold, too tame, will it amuse or be my epitaph? Others turned to drink, like Poland's Stanczyk, whose legendary wit masked a spiraling depression. After his king ignored warnings of an impending war disaster, Stanczyk swapped his bells for a monk's robe, his final joke on a world that demanded laughter while steering toward ruin. Even retirement offered no safety. Ex-jesters knew too many secrets to be left alive. France's Charles IX allegedly had his former fool drowned after overhearing him reminisce about the old king's midnight crimes. Others vanished into obscurity, their tongues cut out or their memoirs burned. The lucky ones, like England's Jane Fool, one of the rare female jesters, received pensions, but only after signing oaths of silence. The darkest truth: many rulers kept jesters precisely because they were disposable. A king could test controversial ideas through a jester's mad ramblings, then disavow them if the court recoiled. When Henry VIII considered breaking with the Catholic Church, his jester Will Sommers staged a skit mocking the Pope, a trial balloon for revolution. Had backlash been severe, Henry could have punished the fool instead of risking his own credibility. This constant peril shaped jesters into masters of survival. They spoke in layers, a joke for the crowd, a warning for the king, an escape clause woven into every punchline. Their humor was armor, their antics a smokescreen. But the strain left marks. Portraits of aging jesters often show hollow eyes beneath the grin, the weight of decades spent dancing on knives. They were the original whistleblowers, therapists, and satirists, roles we now prize, but for which they paid in blood and broken minds. Perhaps that's their real legacy, not the laughter, but the cost behind it. In a world where truth was treason, they played the fool so we wouldn't have to, and sometimes paid the price so others might hear uncomfortable truths. Their bells weren't just for merriment, they were the muffled alarm of conscience in an age that too often chose tyranny over wisdom. Beneath the cap and bells, jesters weren't just purveyors of laughter, they were medieval whistleblowers armed with wit instead of parchment. When kings and queens strayed from their vows or emptied the treasury, it was often a jester's carefully staged antics that dragged secrets into the light. Take the scandal of France's Queen Isabeau, whose rumored affairs became the talk of Paris until her jester, Jacquemin, accidentally tripped during a banquet, spilling wine on a nobleman's doublet to reveal love letters tucked inside. The court erupted in chaos, but Jacquemin's mock apology, "Forgive me, I mistook him for the queen's pillow," ensured no one missed the implication. The noble was exiled, the queen's influence crumbled, and Jacquemin, he vanished from records weeks later, a reminder that exposing royal sins rarely ended well for the messenger. Not all scandals were about affairs. In 15th century Denmark, King Hans' jester, Claus, uncovered a treasonous plot not through solemn investigation, but by performing a drunken puppet show where King Greed and Lord Treason divvied up the kingdom. The real conspirators, seated in the front row, turned pale as clay. Claus's genius, he'd woven their actual names into the puppet dialogue, forcing them to either confess or flee. The king rewarded Claus with land, but the jester wisely donated it to a monastery, knowing gratitude in royal courts was as fleeting as applause. Some jesters played the long game. At the court of Burgundy, the jester Heinzelin spent years dropping foolish remarks about the duke's misplaced war funds, each joke laced with details only an insider would know. When the treasury was finally audited, Heinzelin's decade of coded jests became the roadmap to embezzlement so vast it toppled 3 ministers. His reward: a pension and a permanent guard lest the disgraced nobles seek revenge. The riskiest exposures, though, involved religion. When England's Mary Tudor began burning Protestants, her jester, Jane Fool, staged a skit where Queen Kindness debated Queen Cruelty over a fake pyre. The message was so blatant that Jane was briefly imprisoned, yet Mary, perhaps sensing the crowd's sympathy, released her with a warning. It was a rare victory. Most jesters who mocked the church met grimmer fates. The Vatican's own fool, Martino, was found hanged after parodying a cardinal's sermon with a laundry list of papal indulgences sold for sin discounts. What made these dangerous performances possible? Jesters mastered the art of plausible deniability. A noble couldn't accuse a jester of slander without admitting the joke hit its mark. When Spain's jester Borra hinted at King Philip's infertility by presenting him with hollow eggs laid by the royal hens, the furious monarch could only grit his teeth. Punishing Borra would confirm the court's whispers. Yet for every scandal successfully exposed, there were a dozen silenced by fear or force. The jester who mocked Hungary's King Matthias for executing rivals was sewn into a bear skin and hunted by dogs. Another, in Naples, had his tongue nailed to a board after joking about the Queen's silent infidelities. These weren't just punishments, they were spectacles, warnings to any fool who thought motley made them invincible. The true power of these scandals lay in their delivery. A jester didn't just reveal corruption, they framed it as ridiculous, making the powerful squirm not with accusations, but with laughter they couldn't control. In an age where direct criticism meant death, humor became the last weapon of the fearless, and the first casualty of tyrants who knew that nothing terrified them more than a fool they couldn't silence. At first glance, a jester's costume seems like pure chaos, a riot of clashing colors, jangling bells, and absurd patterns. But every stitch held meaning, every hue hid a jab at power and those ridiculous bells. They weren't just for noise. The jester's motley was a carefully crafted language, a visual satire so bold that only the privilege of folly made it possible. Take the colors. That iconic patchwork wasn't random. It deliberately clashed with the rich, harmonious dyes nobles wore to flaunt their wealth. While lords draped themselves in expensive crimson and sapphire silks, jesters strutted in mismatched scraps, a walking mockery of extravagance. Some historians argue the patches even mirrored heraldic symbols but distorted. A noble's proud lion crest rendered as a stumbling cat, or a fleur-de-lis chopped into vegetable shapes. It was aristocracy turned into a joke, stitched right onto the jester's back where no one could openly object. Then there were the bells, hundreds of them sewn into hats, sleeves, even shoes. Far from mere decoration, they served as acoustic armor. The constant jingle masked private conversations, allowing jesters to eavesdrop without seeming silent. More darkly, their sound mirrored the chains of serfs and prisoners, a sonic reminder of the bondage underlying courtly glamour. In some German courts, jesters wore bells tuned to dissonant chords, creating an unsettling cacophony that mirrored the instability of power itself. The hat alone was a masterpiece of subversion. Those multi-pointed peaks often matched the number of nobles in a ruler's inner circle, with one tip conspicuously drooping to represent the monarch's flawed judgment. Italian jesters took it further, stitching tiny faces onto each point, caricatures of corrupt advisors, their exaggerated features visible only when the jester bowed deeply. Even the bauble, that silly scepter with a fool's head, doubled as a prop for covert messaging. Hollow ones held scrolls, others had faces that flipped to reveal hidden portraits. One surviving example from Bavaria features a jester's head that unscrews to reveal a miniature gallows inside, a not-so-subtle commentary on the fate of those who challenged the crown. The genius of these designs, they weaponized absurdity. A noble couldn't protest being mocked by a jester's outfit without admitting he recognized himself in the parody. Like courtly harlequins, jesters wore the emperor's new clothes, forcing everyone to see the truth while pretending it was all just part of the act. History remembers the jesters who made kings laugh, but few recall the women who turned courtly satire into survival. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, female jesters like Jane Fool and Mathurine de Valois didn't just entertain, they wielded wit as a weapon, carving out space in the most hostile of arenas. These weren't mere curiosities, they were strategists in motley, using their unique position to challenge norms and sometimes rewrite the rules. Take Jane Fool, the only officially recorded female jester in the Tudor court. While Henry VIII's male fools joked about politics, Jane's humor cut deeper. She performed with a doll named Baby Bishop, mocking the clergy's hypocrisy by having it excommunicate rats in the palace kitchens. But her boldest move came when she staged a mock wedding between two dogs, naming them after Henry and Anne of Cleves, a daring jab at the king's infamous divorce. Remarkably, Henry not only tolerated her antics but granted her a pension, suggesting Jane possessed an uncanny ability to balance rebellion with survival. France's Mathurine de Valois operated with even sharper edges. Serving 3 consecutive kings, she performed in full armor, parodying military failures with such precision that generals reportedly begged her to soften her routines. When the Duke of Guise tried to bribe her into mocking his rival, Mathurine turned the tables, announcing at court that she'd found a nobleman so cheap he thinks laughter can be bought. The Duke became the joke, and Mathurine's reputation as untouchable grew. What made these women succeed where male jesters often faltered? Their gender, ironically, became their armor. Female fools were seen as doubly harmless, neither threatening like male advisors nor consequential like noblewomen. This dismissive attitude gave them extraordinary leeway. Jane could critique Henry's marriages precisely because no one believed a woman's words held political weight. Mathurine's armor routine worked because it was deemed charming rather than subversive when delivered by a woman. Yet their acceptance hinged on walking a razor's edge. Male jesters could rage, female jesters had to charm. Records showed Jane often couched her sharpest barbs in nursery rhymes, while Mathurine's critiques were delivered with exaggerated curtsies. Their humor was a masquerade within a masquerade, criticism wrapped in the era's expectations of femininity, then wrapped again in the fool's privilege. The risks they faced were uniquely brutal. When a male jester crossed a line, he might be banished. When female fool Lucrezia of Ferrara mocked her duke's impotence, she was stripped and whipped in the town square, a punishment designed to humiliate beyond pain. Other female jesters vanished from records mid-reign, their fates left to grim speculation. Perhaps their greatest legacy was proving that even in a man's world, laughter could be the ultimate equalizer. Jane Fool's pension wasn't just payment for jokes, it was tacit acknowledgement that her voice held power. Mathurine's armor wasn't just costume, it was a middle finger to the idea that women couldn't critique war. They remind us that the court jester's role wasn't about gender, but about who had the courage to speak when silence was safer, and the wit to make tyranny ridiculous. When armies clashed on medieval battlefields, amidst the clang of steel and the screams of the wounded, an unexpected figure often darted through the chaos: the court jester, his motley a surreal splash of color against the mud and blood. Far from being mere entertainers relegated to campfire songs, jesters played a vital and often overlooked role in warfare, serving as morale boosters, covert messengers, and even battlefield diplomats. Their unique status allowed them to cross enemy lines under the guise of folly, delivering taunts that enraged opponents or whispered offers of truce when swords alone couldn't decide the day. Take the siege of Calais in 1347, where the English jester Roland, no relation to the legendary Farter, reportedly scaled the city walls mid-battle, juggling knives while hurling insults so creative they distracted French archers long enough for English sappers to breach the gates. Or the infamous Fool's Charge at the Battle of Agincourt, where Henry V's jester Raher rode a donkey straight into the French vanguard, waving a sausage like a scepter. The absurd spectacle broke the tension of terrified English troops who roared with laughter, then followed with a rally so fierce it turned the tide. These weren't just stunts, they were psychological warfare, weaponizing absurdity to unsettle enemies and galvanize allies. But jesters did more than mock and distract. They were the medieval equivalent of encrypted radios. During the Wars of the Roses, the Yorkist jester Pickleherring carried battle plans between commanders disguised as nonsense songs. One surviving account describes him performing a nursery rhyme for Richard of York about 3 blind mice losing their heads, a coded warning about Lancastrian ambush positions. Similarly, the Burgundian jester Hainselin smuggled strategic maps inside his hollow marotte, its grotesque face unscrewing to reveal troop movements sketched on parchment. Enemies rarely thought to search a fool's props, assuming their contents were as frivolous as their owners. Their most delicate role, however, was as wartime negotiators. When formal diplomacy failed, jesters could float compromises without either side losing face. In 1485, after months of stalemate between Austria and Hungary, the Jester Kunz von der Rosen brokered a ceasefire by presenting both kings with identical gifts, wooden crowns carved from the same tree, a tangible metaphor for shared sovereignty. The rulers, charmed by the gesture, agreed to terms their advisors had spent years disputing. Likewise, during the Italian Wars, the French Jester Triboulet ended a siege by pretending to sell the keys to a contested city to the enemy commander for a single glass of wine. The farce allowed the defender to surrender without formal humiliation, sparing thousands of lives, yet the risks were dire. Jesters captured behind enemy lines couldn't claim diplomatic immunity. After the Battle of Pavia in 1525, the Spanish executed Francis I's Jester for carrying treasonous jests, later revealed to be a plea for ransom disguised as a bawdy poem. Others were tortured for codes they genuinely didn't know. Many jesters received messages orally, their memories the only safeguard. What made them so effective wasn't just their wit, but their liminality. They existed outside formal hierarchies, making them ideal intermediaries in conflicts where pride trumped reason. A king could reject a herald's terms without consequence, but ignoring a fool's antics risked seeming petty. Their humor disarmed, their neutrality, real or feigned, built bridges, and their deaths, when they came, rarely sparked the reprisals that followed noble envoys' executions. The bitter irony: while chronicles immortalize kings and generals, most wartime jesters vanish unnamed. We know Roland distracted archers at Calais, but not who strung his bells after a crossbow bolt found his heart mid-juggle. The marotte that carried Burgundy's secrets survives in a museum, its maker's identity lost. Their legacy lingers in modern military tactics, the US Army's singing sergeants of World War II, who boosted morale with USO shows, or today's psychological operations units that blend misinformation with satire. The tools evolved, but the strategy remains the same. Sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a sword, but a well-timed laugh in the face of death. They called it the fool's gift, those eerie moments when a jester's joke twisted into prophecy, when laughter curdled into dread as their words came true. History brims with tales of jesters who seem to peer through time, their barbs laced with uncanny foresight. Whether coincidence, clever observation, or something more mystical, these court clowns wielded a reputation as living omens, their nonsense rhymes cracking open like eggs to reveal the future inside. Consider Stańczyk, the most famous prophetic fool of Poland. When King Sigismund I celebrated the birth of his heir with a lavish tournament, Stańczyk refused to attend. Pressed for an explanation, he muttered that a child who costs a kingdom in candles will cost more in cannon fire. 10 years later, that very prince ignited a disastrous war with Moscow, exactly as the jester foretold. Stańczyk's predictions grew more chilling with time. He once placed a broken hourglass on the throne during a feast, whispering, "When the sand runs out, so do we." Weeks later, the royal line collapsed in a coup. France had its own oracle in Triboulet, whose jokes about a lion eating its own tail were dismissed as drunken ramblings until King Louis XII died of a perforated ulcer, his digestion literally consuming him. Even Shakespeare immortalized this trope in King Lear, where the fool's riddles, the hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long slash that it had its head bit off by its young, mirrored the monarch's coming betrayal. But how much was prophecy and how much was pattern recognition? Jesters spent years studying their rulers' flaws, watching alliances fracture and tempers flare. When England's Will Sommers predicted Henry VIII's rift with Rome by joking that the king's conscience follows his weddings, it wasn't magic, it was acute political insight disguised as folly. Similarly, the Spanish jester Borra's prophecy of Emperor Charles V's abdication, mockingly presenting him with a monk's robe years before it happened, likely stemmed from private moments where the weary ruler confessed his longing for retirement. The darkest predictions, though, were the ones no one heeded. During the Black Death, the Bavarian jester Markov paraded through streets ringing a bell and chanting, "Dance now, for soon you'll dance underground." Those who dismissed him as mad lived to watch half their cities perish. In Venice, the fool nag drew cartoons of sinking gondolas months before the infamous floods of 1524. And at the doomed court of Richard III, the Jester Cole staged a play where King Owl was pecked to death by common birds, a grim mirror of Bosworth Field. Perhaps their real power lay in the freedom to voice what others feared. While astrologers couched warnings in cautious verse, jesters shouted them through masks of madness. When Scotland's Archibald Armstrong tossed a rotten egg at Charles I's feet, declaring, "This is your reign's first fruit," the court gasped, but the king, blind to the omen, laughed. A decade later, his head rolled from the executioner's block. The line between clown and seer was always thin. Jesters straddled worlds close enough to power to see its cracks, yet detached enough to name them. Their prophecies endure not as supernatural feats, but as testament to the most terrifying gift of all, the clarity of those society dismisses as fools. After all, when the mirrors of truth are shattered, sometimes only a jester's broken fragments remain sharp enough to draw blood. In the grand chessboard of medieval power, no institution loomed larger than the church, and no players provoked its wrath quite like the jesters who dared to mock it. While kings might tolerate a fool's barbs about taxation or infidelity, religious authorities drew a hard line at heresy. For jesters, this created a perilous tightrope: how to satirize corruption without crossing into blasphemy, and how to make audiences laugh when the punchline might damn them to hell. The results, some of history's most audacious acts of rebellion, and some of its bloodiest reprisals. Take the case of the Vatican's own jester, Martino, who devised a sale of sins routine during Pope Alexander VI's reign. Parodying the rampant sale of indulgences, he set up a mock stall offering discounts on commandments, adultery half off if confessed before noon. The crowd roared, but Martino was found hanged 3 days later, his bells stuffed into his mouth. The message was clear: mockery of divine authority wouldn't be tolerated, even under the banner of folly. Yet jesters kept pushing boundaries. In 15th century England, Will Sommers performed a skit where Bishop Greed and Abbot Sloth played dice with communion wafers while peasants starved. Henry VIII reportedly laughed so hard he cried, but when Sommers took the act on the road, local clergy had him flogged for sacrilege. This duality defined the jester church dynamic: protected at court, hunted in the parishes. The bravest fools weaponized scripture itself. Germany's Kunz von der Rosen once interrupted a bishop's fire and brimstone sermon by releasing trained doves with tiny scrolls tied to their legs. "Blessed are the jesters, for they shall inherit the laughs." The furious bishop excommunicated him on the spot, only for Emperor Maximilian to revoke the order, declaring Holy Writ too heavy for feathers to bear. Women jesters faced even fiercer backlash. When the Italian fool Margherita staged a parody of nuns gossiping in confession, the local convent branded her a witch. Her defense: she'd learned the dialogue by hiding in their choir loft, proof the satire was fact, not fabrication. The scandal forced the bishop to censure the nuns, but Margherita disappeared shortly after, her fate a mystery. What made the church such a dangerous foe? Unlike kings, who might pardon a jester's insult for a good laugh, clergy saw mockery as existential threat. A fool's joke about gluttonous monks undermined divine order. A satire of indulgences struck at church finances. And because jesters performed for illiterate masses, their routines, not sermons, often shaped public opinion. When Burgundy's Jester Heinzelin staged a play where Saint Greed charged peasants to enter heaven, entire villages began refusing tithes. The archbishop's response: he ordered Heinzelin's tongue nailed to the cathedral door as a lesson in reverence. Some jesters turned martyrdom into performance. Spain's Borra, sentenced to burn for joking that the Inquisition roasted men like chestnuts, requested his pyre be built on stage. His last act, dancing in chains while singing a ballad about the devil who feared laughter more than fire. The execution drew such uncomfortable laughter that future heresy trials banned audiences. The Church's ultimate revenge, though, was appropriation. By the Renaissance, many clerical writers claimed Jesters subversive, which was itself divine, a holy folly that mirrored Christ-mocking Pharisees. Suddenly, the same institution that had silenced fools began canonizing their spirit. Erasmus penned in praise of folly, Dominican friars staged comic morality plays, and even the Pope kept a sacred fool to parody corruption within the Vatican walls. It was the final irony. The rebels had become relics, their danger neutered by the very power they'd challenged, yet traces of their defiance linger. When a 21st-century comedian mocks televangelists or a satirist skewers religious hypocrisy, they walk a path first carved by those medieval fools who believed truth, even when heretical, was worth laughing about. The bells may have fallen silent, but the echoes still unsettle the mighty. Shakespeare's fools were never just comic relief, they were the razor-sharp conscience of his plays, slicing through pretense with rhymes and riddles. Take King Lear's fool, whose jingles about nothing coming from nothing haunt the crumbling monarch like a ghost of his own poor judgment. While nobles flatter and lie, the fool strips truth bare, calling Lear's disastrous division of the kingdom an egg divided by a dull spoon, a metaphor so visceral it still stings centuries later. Even as storms rage and madness mounts, the fool remains the only character who dares say what others won't. That power without wisdom is a crown of straw. And then, in one of literature's most chilling absences, he vanishes after Act 3, his fate unspoken. Some scholars argue Shakespeare silenced him because the world had grown too cruel for truth-tellers. Others whisper that the fool, having done his duty, simply stepped offstage before the bloodshed began. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales paints jesters in darker hues. The miller and the summoner, though not court fools, embody the trickster spirit, crude, cunning, and unafraid to expose hypocrisy. But it's the pardoner who steals the show as a jester gone rogue. With his bag of fake relics and sermons about greed, he's a walking parody of church corruption, yet audiences laugh uneasily because his confession rings true. Though I preach against vice, I practice it myself. Here, the jester's mirror doesn't just mock, it cracks, revealing the rot beneath medieval piety. Folklore amplified their mystique. German legends tell of Till Eulenspiegel, a prankster who tricks priests into baptizing a donkey and nobles into eating dung pies, all while whistling a tune. But beneath the chaos lies a deeper justice. His victims always earn their humiliation through arrogance or cruelty. French fabliaux featured jester figures like Richute, a washerwoman who outwits scholars with wordplay, proving wit could be a peasant's weapon against the educated elite. Even King Arthur's court had Dagonet, a knight jester whose mock battles exposed the Round Table's vanity, asking, "If all men are equal, why do some sit closer to the king?" These portrayals share a thread, the jester as humanity's ID, voicing what society suppresses. When Shakespeare's touchstone in As You Like It quips, "The truest poetry is the most feigning," he winks at the audience, acknowledging that folly and truth are two sides of the same coin. Chaucer's pardoner, though vile, forces pilgrims to confront their own moral compromises, and folklore's tricksters, they remind us that laughter can topple tyrants, one well-aimed joke at a time. The brilliance of these literary jesters lies in their duality. They amuse but unsettle, speak nonsense that's wiser than sermons, and vanish when their work is done, leaving kings, readers, and history itself to puzzle over their legacy. From Lear's shattered mind to Eulenspiegel's echoing laugh, they prove that the fool's cap isn't just a costume. It's the only hat that fits a world turned upside down. A jester's performance was never just about jokes. It was a high-stakes symphony of skills, each one finely tuned to command attention, deflect suspicion, or deliver a lethal truth wrapped in laughter. Imagine the scene. One moment, a jester might be plucking a lute with the delicacy of a troubadour, lulling the court into complacency. The next, he'd be flipping backward over a banquet table, landing with perfect precision to whisper a biting satire in the king's ear. This wasn't just entertainment, it was tactical artistry, a toolbox of talents honed to disarm and dazzle in equal measure. Take music, the most disarming weapon in their arsenal. A well-played lute or pipe could soothe a monarch's temper, creating the perfect moment to slip in a daring critique. England's Will Sommers famously composed ballads with double meanings lyrics about faithless hounds that seemed playful until the court realized they mirrored the king's betrayals by his advisors. In Bavaria, the jester Markov used his fiddle to mimic the whines of corrupt ministers, changing tempos to match their shifting loyalties. Music also served as camouflage. Jesters like Francis Heinzelin would sing nonsense verses while memorizing confidential documents left carelessly open on noblemen's desks, their melodies masking the scrape of parchment being subtly shifted for a better view. Acrobatics, though, were the ultimate misdirection. A backflip wasn't just spectacle, it was a calculated maneuver to eavesdrop. Spanish jester Borra would tumble between clusters of conspiring nobles, his bells covering the rustle of their whispers, then accidentally collide with a servant to relay overheard plots. Physical comedy, too, had teeth. When Denmark's Klaus mocked a general's cowardice by reenacting battles with sausage puppets, his exaggerated pratfalls made the satire undeniable. Even something as simple as juggling could be weaponized. Jesters in Italian courts would toss apples or knives in intricate patterns, their movements hypnotic enough to distract guards while secret messages were passed beneath the table. But the sharpest tool was always wit. A master jester's wordplay operated on three levels: surface nonsense, layered meaning, and a hidden barb only the intended target would fully grasp. Scotland's Archibald Armstrong once praised King James' wisdom by comparing him to Solomon, for both loved foreign wives and built temples to false gods. The court roared, the king initially beamed, and only later did the heresy sting. Riddles were especially potent. Burgundy's Jester staged a riddle contest where each answer revealed a noble scandal, like peeling an onion to its rotten core. The true genius of these skills, their deniability. A lute's melody could be innocent or insidious, a tumble might be clumsy or calculated, and a joke, well, only a guilty man would take offense at folly. When Poland's Stanczyk pretended to trip and spill wine on a treasonous letter during a feast, his oafish apology, "Forgive me, my lord, I mistook your secrets for a napkin," forced the conspirator to either laugh along or confess. Yet mastering this toolkit demanded grueling discipline. Historical accounts describe jesters practicing knife-throwing at dawn, composing verses long into the night, and rehearsing falls until bruises layered over bruises. Their training blended the rigor of knights with the creativity of poets, because one misstep, literal or verbal, could be fatal. The Venetian jester Zuan spent years perfecting a single trick, balancing a dagger on his nose while reciting satirical sonnets, a feat that later saved his life when the Doge, impressed, pardoned him for a treasonous punchline. Their legacy lives on in modern performers, comedians who weave social commentary into stand-up, circus artists who blend danger with satire, even political cartoonists who skewer power with a stroke of ink. But none carried the visceral risk of the medieval jester, whose stage was a hall of swords, and whose audience held the power of life or death over every note, flip, and razor-edged quip. The jester's bells might have been the only sound that could cut through the deafening isolation of power. Imagine ruling a kingdom where every smile hides a plot, where trust is a currency more fragile than glass. This was the daily reality of medieval monarchs. And in that gilded cage of paranoia and pressure, the court jester often became something far more profound than an entertainer, a lifeline, a confessor, the closest thing kings and queens had to a therapist. Modern psychologists might call it venting or emotional regulation, but centuries before Freud, jesters were already practicing a crude yet startlingly effective form of mental health care for the mighty. Consider the case of England's Henry VII, a king so consumed by suspicion he barely slept. His jester, Patch, didn't just tell jokes. He orchestrated elaborate nightly routines to ease the king's anxiety. Historical accounts describe Patch performing a ritual of the 7 laughs, a structured comedy sequence that built from gentle wordplay to absurd physical comedy, deliberately designed to release tension. Chroniclers noted the king's shoulders would visibly unclench by the 5th routine, his breathing slowing as if under a spell. Today, we'd recognize this as a primitive form of exposure therapy, gradually dialing down stress responses through controlled humor. The science behind this is no joke. Laughter triggers endorphins, nature's stress relief chemicals, while reducing cortisol, the hormone linked to fear and aggression. Jesters intuitively understood this biochemistry centuries before it had a name. France's King Charles VI, who suffered bouts of psychosis, relied on his jester Gilibert to reset his moods. When Charles fixated on paranoid delusions, Gilibert would abruptly mimic his frantic speech in a squeaky voice, breaking the spiral with absurdity. Court physicians recorded that these interruptions often restored the king's lucidity for days, a phenomenon modern therapists might compare to cognitive disruption techniques. But jesters did more than distract, they listened. Unlike sycophantic advisors, jesters could offer unconditional positive regard, that cornerstone of modern therapy. Spain's Jester Borra famously carried a grievance puppet, a ragged doll nobles could whisper complaints to when the king was present. The puppet then repeated them in exaggerated squeaks, allowing criticisms to be voiced without attribution. This wasn't just play acting, it created psychological safety for rulers to hear hard truths without losing face. In Scotland, James III's jester kept a jest book where the king scribbled private fears, later transformed into comedy routines that aired his anxieties without direct confrontation. The tragic flip side, many jesters paid a steep psychic price for this emotional labor. The diary of Venetian jester Zuon reveals haunting passages about wearing the king's nightmares like a second costume. Others developed what we'd now call caregiver fatigue. Poland's Stanczyk reportedly grew gaunt and hollow-eyed after years of managing his monarch's moods, his own mental health crumbling under the weight. Some rulers recognized this sacrifice. England's Richard II granted his fool land for bearing the burdens no lord dare carry. Perhaps the most poignant therapeutic role jesters played was in royal grief. When Queen Isabella of Castile lost her heir, she refused all comfort except her jesters. For weeks, the fool repeated a simple routine, dropping a glass ball and watching it shatter, then producing an identical one from his sleeve. The message, some breaks can't be mended, but beauty persists. Centuries before grief counseling existed, that jester gave his queen permission to mourn without despair. Their legacy lingers in unexpected places. The court jester archetype evolved into the modern talk show host who helps audiences process collective trauma through humor. The grievance puppet resurfaced in psychologist Carl Rogers' empty chair technique. Even the rhythmic structure of Patch's 7 laughs mirrors contemporary EMDR therapy's bilateral stimulation. What medieval courts understood instinctively, that laughter and truth must walk hand in hand to keep power human, we're still rediscovering today, one therapeutic chuckle at a time. On the gallows steps where most men trembled, jesters sometimes stood as the last friendly face, an unsettling paradox of medieval justice. These weren't mere coincidental encounters. Some executioners actively employed jesters as softeners of doom, tasked with easing prisoners' final hours through humor or delivering whispered farewells too dangerous for others to carry. In the shadow of the scaffold, motley and noose formed an unholy alliance, binding society's 2 most outcast roles in a macabre dance of mercy and message running. Take the notorious case of England's hanging jester, Dick Tarleton, who frequented Newgate Prison in the 1500s. Charged with entertaining condemned thieves before their executions, he developed a grim specialty, turning their crimes into bawdy ballads so exaggerated that crowds laughed instead of jeered. One account describes him singing a thief's misadventures as he mounted the scaffold, ending with a wink, "Steal the rope next time, lad," that drew such laughter the man died smiling. But Tarleton's real service was covert. The night before executions, he'd play cards with inmates, deliberately losing to give them one last victory, and slipping family messages beneath the table when guards weren't looking. France took this practice to even darker extremes. The executioner of Paris, Charles Sanson, kept a jester on staff specifically to extract confessions through humor. Historical records describe Le Fou Sanson, a nameless jester who'd share wine with prisoners, gradually getting them to reveal accomplices through riddles and drinking games. His most infamous success, getting a serial poisoner to disclose her hidden arsenic stash by joking about spicing the executioner's breakfast, the grim punchline. She was granted a quicker hanging instead of burning for her cooperation. Some partnerships defied logic entirely. In 15th century Nuremberg, executioner Franz Schmidt employed a legless jester called Hop Along Hans, who'd literally roll himself to the condemned in a wheelbarrow. Hans specialized in gallows humor so outrageous it shattered prisoners' terror, like offering to hold their legs during the drop or betting them they couldn't die with their eyes crossed. But beneath the antics lay meticulous psychology. Schmidt's journals note that prisoners comforted by Hans went to their deaths more peacefully, reducing crowd unrest over botched executions. The duo became so infamous that local clergy accused them of stealing souls from God's judgment by making death seem trivial. The messaging system was equally perilous. Jesters acting as final couriers often risked their necks. When Mary, Queen of Scots, faced execution, her jester Nicholas supposedly smuggled her last letter by swallowing it, only to be force-fed purgatives by Elizabeth's agents. More cunning was the Spanish jester Perico, who memorized dying rebels' messages, then encoded them into nonsense songs performed for their families. His masterpiece, turning a man's final words, "The gold is buried beneath the olive tree," into a nursery rhyme about a lazy bird hiding nuts, leading the widow to the stash while avoiding the Inquisition's notice. What made this alliance work was mutual benefit. Executioners gained prisoners who didn't struggle or scream, preserving their professional reputation. Jesters earned rare protection. Even feared headsmen hesitated to harm colleagues who made their job easier, but the emotional toll was crushing. The diary of Venetian jester Zuan records him vomiting before every execution morning, then donning his bells to dance with the dead before they cooled. Others, like Poland's Stanczyk, grew numb, writing that laughter curdles when used as a shroud. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is how these jesters weaponized humor against despair itself. In a Munich dungeon, a condemned knight carved this final note after his jester's visit: "Today I learned that death is not the end of laughter, only of the fool who makes it." Centuries later, that paradox still echoes. In societies that deemed them worthless, jesters became the only ones who could look death in the eye and make it blink. While the court jester's role often involved serving kings, some of history's most daring fools turned their wit toward rebellion, using their privileged position to stoke the fires of dissent. These weren't just performers, they were covert revolutionaries, disguising calls to arms in raucous comedy and slipping revolutionary messages between the lines of bawdy songs. When peasants groaned under crushing taxes or nobles plotted against tyrants, jesters became the unexpected architects of revolt, their immunity allowing them to operate where spies and rebels dared not tread. Take the infamous Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. While history remembers the rebel leader Wat Tyler, few recall the jester Jack O' the Bells, who traveled between villages disguised as a wandering minstrel. His Ballad of the Turnip King, a seemingly silly tale about vegetables rebelling against a gluttonous farmer, contained coded meeting points and attack timings. The song spread like wildfire through taverns, its chorus, "When the bell tolls thrice, the harvest rises," becoming the revolt's rallying cry. By the time authorities realized the joke was on them, half of Kent was in flames. France's Jacquerie uprising saw even bolder tactics. The jester Gilot le Sauteur, literally Gilot the Leaper, used his acrobatic routines to map out noble estates for rebel bands. During performances at manor houses, his tumbling passes were carefully calculated to note weak points in defenses, while his signature trick, jumping over a burning hoop, secretly signaled which granaries to torch first. When the revolt was crushed, Gilot's immunity saved him from the mass executions, though chronicles note he mysteriously tripped into a well weeks later. Some jesters played both sides with chilling precision. In the German Peasants' War, the jester Kunz von der Rosen performed a skit for nobles about the fox who outran the hounds, seemingly a light-hearted fable. But the fox's escape route, a disguised map of the local mine tunnels, allowed rebels to ambush the Lord's cavalry. Kunz's real masterpiece, convincing the nobility the skit was a satire of peasant incompetence, so they demanded repeat performances, unwittingly spreading rebel intelligence to every stronghold in the region. The Reformation added religious fuel to these fires. When Protestant rebels plotted against Catholic rulers, jesters became key message carriers, exploiting their freedom to cross battle lines. The Dutch jester Clees Campeen hid Calvinist pamphlets inside his hollow marotte, while his act, mocking both Luther and the Pope with equal vigor, kept him above suspicion. His downfall came when a nervous rebel cracked under interrogation, revealing Clees's role. The jester's punishment, forced to perform his own execution by juggling lit torches until he dropped one onto the pyre beneath him. Perhaps the most audacious rebel jester was Italy's Giangurgiello, who infiltrated the oppressive Spanish viceroy's court in Naples. His comedy of errors, routines, full of bumbling Spanish soldiers outwitted by clever peasants, became so popular that crowds began reenacting them in the streets, with real Spanish officials as the butts of the jokes. When the viceroy banned the act, Giangurgiello simply switched to puppet shows, where wooden caricatures of the regime accidentally caught fire night after night. The uprising that followed saw puppet stages become rallying points, proving satire could be as lethal as any sword. But why were jesters so effective at rebellion? Their immunity was only part of the answer. More crucially, they understood the power of narrative. A well-crafted joke could crystallize injustice in ways speeches never did. When Bohemia's Jester Penkowa mocked his king's excesses by leading a parade of starving children dressed as courtiers, the image seared itself into public consciousness. Likewise, the Hungarian jester Dudos's Dance of the Empty Pot, where he pretended to cook a feast using only air, turned famine into a spectacle nobles couldn't ignore. The risks were unimaginable. Captured rebel jesters faced creative horrors. The Spanish Inquisition burned one alive inside his own puppet theater, while a Bavarian duke force fed another his own bells after discovering hidden riot plans in their clappers. Yet their legacy endures in every protest song, every political cartoon, every viral meme that shakes the powerful. Long before social media, jesters proved laughter could be the ultimate Trojan horse, hiding revolution in plain sight, one punchline at a time. By the early 1700s, the sound of jingling bells grew fainter in Europe's halls of power, not with a final punchline but a slow fade into irrelevance. The decline of court jesters wasn't sudden. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one reflecting a world outgrowing medieval absurdity. The first blow came from politics itself. As kingdoms centralized into modern states, rulers no longer needed a fool to whisper truths. They had bureaucrats, newspapers, and diplomatic corps. Why risk satire from a jester when you could read a carefully worded memo from your minister? The Spanish court typified this shift. When Bourbon kings took the throne in 1714, they replaced their jester with a royal statistician, declaring that laughter belongs in taverns, not ledgers of state. Theatre delivered another mortal wound. Renaissance playwrights like Shakespeare had already blurred the line between jesters and actors, but by the 18th century, professional theatres offered something no jester could compete with: scripted, repeatable entertainment without the risk of unscripted barbs. London's Drury Lane Theatre became the new epicenter of wit, where audiences could laugh at caricatures of power without worrying about offending their dinner hosts. The final irony: many ex-jesters found work as comic actors, trading their motley for theatrical costumes. France's last royal jester, Brusquet, ended his career playing fools in Molière's comedies, his improvisational skills now confined to rehearsed lines. Royal tastes evolved just as drastically. Enlightenment ideals prized reason over ribaldry, and monarchs wanted to project sophistication, not medieval superstition. Prussia's Frederick the Great epitomized this shift. When his father's jester tried to revive old routines, Frederick reportedly snapped, "We no longer measure crowns by how well they tolerate mockery." Instead, he stocked his court with philosophers like Voltaire, who delivered criticism in polished essays rather than riddles. Even the Habsburgs, longtime patrons of jesters, replaced theirs with Italian opera singers, preferring the controlled drama of arias to the unpredictability of a fool's antics. Economic pressures sealed their fate. Maintaining a jester had always been a luxury, but as wars drained treasuries, kings scrutinized every expense. England's Queen Anne famously dismissed her fool in 1707, declaring his salary better spent on one cannon. Across Europe, jesters were pensioned off or reassigned as glorified caretakers for royal pets. The ledgers of Versailles tell a telling story. In 1680, the jester's budget equaled 3 musicians. By 1720, it couldn't cover a stable boy's wages. Yet some clung to tradition stubbornly. Russia's Peter the Great kept a jester not out of nostalgia, but as a living relic, a human cabinet of curiosities to amuse foreign ambassadors. His mock court of drunken jesters, complete with a fool pope and jester generals, was less a tribute than a grotesque parody of medievalism. By then, the role had curdled into self-parody, its original purpose lost. The final indignity came when jesters became collector's items for aristocrats slumming in medieval cosplay. A 1725 German catalogue advertised authentic court fools, slightly used alongside antique armor and falconry gear. The last documented royal jester, Denmark's Per Pedersen, was dismissed in 1740 as an embarrassment to enlightened rule. His departure marked the end of an era, but not the end of the jester's spirit. You'll still find echoes of their defiance in political cartoonists who skewer leaders with ink instead of jests, in late-night comedians who deliver truths under the guise of laughter, even in protesters wielding irony as their sharpest weapon. The bells may have fallen silent, but the fool's most enduring joke was on history itself. They vanished just as the world needed their irreverence most. Though the last royal jesters vanished centuries ago, their spirit never truly left the stage. It simply traded motley for microphones and marots for memes. Modern comedians, satirists, and even workplace provocateurs are the direct descendants of those medieval truth-tellers, wielding humor as both shield and scalpel in a world still allergic to uncomfortable truths. Consider late-night hosts like John Oliver or Samantha Bee, whose segments dissect political corruption with the same precision jesters once used to expose royal excess. When Oliver mocks corporate greed by burying a stadium in shredded dollar bills, he's channeling the same theatricality as the jester who dumped rotten fruit at a king's feet to protest famine. The tools have changed: green screens instead of juggling knives, viral clips instead of whispered riddles, but the mission remains: to make power squirm under the spotlight of laughter. Political cartoonists continue the tradition even more overtly. Banksy's shredded artwork at auction echoed the Jester's practice of subverting expectations, while digital satirists like The Onion weaponize absurd headlines to reveal systemic hypocrisy, much like Jesters framed corruption as ridiculous to bypass censorship. During the Arab Spring, protesters in Egypt carried signs with jokes about Mubarak's regime, a tactic straight from the medieval fool's playbook, where ridicule became rebellion when direct criticism meant death. Even dictatorships struggle to suppress this kind of dissent. China's grass mud horse meme, which used homophones to mock censorship, proved that Jester's coded language thrives in the digital age. Corporate culture has unwittingly revived the Jester's role too. Silicon Valley's chief fun officers and Google's culture czars may lack bells and baubles, but their job to challenge groupthink and puncture executive egos mirrors the court fool's duty. When a Microsoft employee staged a parody video skewering their own product's flaws, it recalled the Jester who performed mock battles to expose a king's weak defenses. These modern fools walk the same tightrope, too gentle and they're ignored, too sharp and they're fired. The difference: today's Jesters trade pensions for stock options. The most striking evolution lies in activism. Greta Thunberg's deadpan, "How dare you?" speech channeled the Jester's gift for reducing complex failures to stark, undeniable truths. Protest groups like the Yes Men, who impersonate CEOs to reveal corporate malfeasance, are essentially rogue Jesters performing guerrilla theater. Even Anonymous, with its masked hacktivism, echoes the anonymity of medieval fools, their identities irrelevant, their messages indelible. What binds these modern Jesters to their ancestors is the understanding that laughter doesn't just entertain, it disarms. A tweet mocking a politician's gaffe can do more damage than a formal indictment, just as a Jester's rhyme about royal incompetence could topple a minister. The difference now: the audience is the court and the stakes are global. The bells may be gone, but the fools, bless them, are still dancing on the knife's edge. Beneath the laughter and jingling bells, some whisper that Jesters were more than lone truth-tellers. They were part of a shadowy brotherhood stretching across Europe, a secret network preserving forbidden knowledge under the noses of kings. Legends speak of a fool's guild, where coded ballads hid heresies and acrobatic routines passed encrypted messages between courts. One persistent myth claims Jesters safeguarded the lost wisdom of persecuted groups, from Cathar mystics to Jewish scholars, weaving their teachings into nursery rhymes and slapstick. The 14th century Chronicle of Metz describes a troupe of traveling entertainers caught with devil's parchments, sewn into their motley, later revealed to be Arabic medical texts banned by the church. Were these mere smugglers or proof of an underground intellectual resistance wearing motley as camouflage? The most tantalizing theory centers on the silent Jesters of Renaissance Italy, allegedly a cell of disgraced philosophers and scientists who infiltrated courts as fools to continue their work. Records from Venice's secret archives mention a buffoon called Dr. Buffone, whose nonsensical drawings of flying machines and water pumps matched Leonardo da Vinci's stolen notebooks. Coincidence or evidence that Jesters served as the era's dead-drop operatives? Even their props raise suspicions. The hollow, bauble scepters many carried could conceal scrolls, while the grotesque faces carved on their marots often bore uncanny resemblances to banned thinkers. A surviving example in Prague's museum unscrews to reveal a tiny compartment perfect for smuggling gemstones or poison. Then there's the chilling case of that laughing plague. In 1522, as Luther's Reformation sparked witch hunts across Germany, a band of Jesters reportedly spread coded warnings to reformist sympathizers through a viral dance of the stumbling friar. Authorities dismissed it as crass comedy until entire villages fled persecution hours before raids. The pattern repeated during France's St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where Jesters allegedly used a children's game about broken bells to guide Protestants to safe houses. These weren't isolated incidents. From Scotland to Hungary, folk tales describe fools' rings of hidden sanctuaries where jesters sheltered refugees, their motley acting as passports across borders. Skeptics dismiss such stories as romanticized folklore, but physical evidence lingers. In 2012, restorers at Château de Chinon found strange carvings beneath the Jester's tower, alchemical symbols mixed with musical notation. When played on a medieval lute, the tune aligns perfectly with a surviving Cathar prayer. And in Spain, the crypto-jester hypothesis gained traction when researchers discovered that 15th-century fool's caps from Jewish households contained tiny Torah verses embroidered in thread that only glowed under Sabbath candlelight. Perhaps the most explosive theory involves the Habsburg dynasty. Letters between Emperor Maximilian and his spymaster reference our fools in England, who supplied intelligence on Henry VIII's marital schemes. One heavily redacted page mentions a jester's gathering at Burgundy in 1494. The same year, a mysterious fire destroyed records of the Spanish Inquisition's interrogations. Coincidence, or had the fools, tired of being history's punchline, decided to burn their own archives? The truth may lie somewhere between conspiracy and casualty. Jesters certainly had means, motive, and opportunity to operate as a network. Their travel between courts was unrestricted, their costumes perfect for concealment, their language impenetrable to outsiders. But whether they were organized revolutionaries or merely opportunistic allies of the oppressed remains history's most tantalizing unsolved riddle. One thing's certain. If such a brotherhood existed, they left no manifestos, only laughter echoing through the centuries, daring us to read between the jests. In the moonlit corridors of Château de Brissac, deep in France's Loire Valley, guests still report hearing the faint jingle of bells and laughter that turns to sobs by dawn. This is the domain of the Green Jester, a ghost said to be the spirit of a 15th-century fool murdered by his own duke. According to local lore, the jester discovered his lord's plot to poison a rival noble and tried to warn the victim through a coded puppet show. The duke, recognizing the betrayal, had the fool strangled with his own jesting scarf and tossed into the castle's deepest oubliette. But the jester got the last laugh. His final curse, whispered as he choked, promised the duke would dance with death before the next full moon. Records show the noble dropped dead of a seizure during a masquerade ball 12 days later. Now, visitors claim the Green Jester's spectre mimics their movements like a twisted reflection, his hollow eyes weeping black tears as he points toward the hidden dungeon where his bones still lie. Across the English Channel, Hampton Court Palace boasts an even more mischievous phantom, the ghost of Will Sommers, Henry VIII's favorite fool. Unlike most tragic specters, Will's spirit seems determined to keep the court laughing for eternity. Security cameras have captured mysterious figures juggling invisible objects in the Tudor kitchens, while tour guides tell of a cold spot near the royal chapel that erupts in giggles when anyone mentions Anne Boleyn. The most chilling encounter occurred in 1999, when a night guard swore he saw a jester's shadow perform an elaborate bow to an empty throne only for the adjacent portrait of Henry to slide off the wall moments later. Conservationists found no broken hooks or natural causes. Perhaps Will still entertains his capricious king 5 centuries after their deaths, but not all jester ghosts play harmless tricks. In Germany's Burg Frankenstein, the legend of Casper the Cutter warns visitors to stay clear of the East Tower after midnight. The story goes that this 18th-century jester went mad after his lord forced him to perform while plague ravaged his village. When the noble laughed at news of the jester's dead family, Casper slit his throat mid-joke with a concealed razor. Now hikers report being tickled by invisible fingers that leave deep scratches, while others hear a sing-song voice whispering, "Shall I cut your sorrows away?" In the dialect of Old Hessian, the castle's caretakers keep a log of these encounters. The most disturbing entry describes a tourist who fled screaming about a smiling man in harlequin rags who balanced a blood-stained straight razor on his nose. Scotland's Glomys Castle offers a darker twist, the tale of Earl Beardy's doomed jester, who allegedly played dice with the devil himself. According to 17th century chronicles, the Earl and his fool were gambling one stormy night when a stranger joined their game. As the jester's luck turned uncannily good, he noticed the stranger's feet were cloven. His final jest, tossing holy water onto the cards, the enraged devil cursed them to play for eternity in the castle's secret chamber. To this day, staff report dice rattling in sealed rooms and an overwhelming scent of sulfur near the old card tower. One maid in the 1920s claimed she saw 3 shadows throwing dice against a wall. The middle figure had horns. Perhaps the most tragic revenant haunts Italy's Castello di Montebello, where the weeping fool mourns a love lost to politics. In the 1300s, Jester Guido and noblewoman Beatrice conducted a secret affair, communicating through songs he performed at feasts. When her family discovered the relationship, they locked Beatrice in a convent and had Guido's tongue cut out. His ghost now wanders the castle's moon garden, fingers pressed to his mutilated mouth while a ghostly lute plays their song, a melody modern visitors sometimes hum without knowing why. The castle's archivist discovered a chilling footnote in the family ledger. Beatrice died the same night as Guido, her convent cell walls scratched with lyrics only a jester would know. These stories share an eerie pattern. The ghosts aren't mere echoes, but active participants still playing their roles. Whether seeking justice like the Green Jester, companionship like Guido, or simply one last laugh like Will, they remind us that the fool's work never truly ends. Their curses, pranks, and sorrows outlive stone walls and royal lines, proving that some performances refuse to fade to black. So next time you hear unexpected laughter in an ancient hall, listen closely. It might not be an echo but an encore. While Europe's jesters danced in candlelit halls, their counterparts across the globe were spinning satire into survival with equally sharp wit, just under different names. Take China's court jesters, the Yuan, who flourished as far back as the Qin dynasty. Unlike their European peers, these entertainers often wielded calligraphy brushes alongside their jokes, composing poems that stung like scorpions wrapped in silk. One legendary Yuan, Meng Zong during the Tang dynasty, saved his own neck after offending the emperor by instantly improvising a flattering couplet about the ruler's eyebrows resembling the wings of a phoenix. The court erupted in laughter, the emperor's rage dissolved, and Meng's quick thinking became the standard for a Yuan's dual role, wordsmith and political tightrope walker. Their humor was layered like lotus petal surface beauty hiding bitter truths. When the lavish Emperor Yong of the Sui dynasty bankrupted the treasury for a pleasure cruise, his Yuan presented him with a toy boat carved from rotten wood. "Since your majesty prefers style over substance," he quipped, "this vessel matches your policies perfectly." The gasp of the court was louder than any applause. Venture to the Islamic Golden Age, and you'd find the Mutayyaman court jesters who blended Sufi wisdom with biting satire. These madcaps weren't just fools, they were spiritual provocateurs. The Abbasid caliphs prized them precisely because their antics defied rigid orthodoxy, creating a space to question power without outright rebellion. One famous Mutayyim, Bulul the Wise, played the fool so convincingly that when he prophesied a vizier's downfall in rhyming nonsense, the court dismissed it until the prediction came true weeks later. His secret, like European jesters, Bulul exploited his madness to observe freely, noting which officials flinched at the caliph's name, which generals drank too deeply during war councils. But Islamic jesters carried an extra layer of protection. Their humor often drew from Quranic parables, making criticism divinely ambiguous. When a greedy emir taxed date palms into extinction, his Mutayyim planted a single dead palm in the courtyard and prayed over it daily. Asked to explain, he sighed, "If even trees flee your taxes, how long before people do?" The emir revoked the tax the next dawn. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Native American tribes revered trickster figures like coyote or raven nature's jesters who taught through chaos. Unlike European fools bound to courts, these spirits roamed freely, their pranks exposing human folly with the randomness of a thunderclap. The Lakota tell of Iktomi, the spider trickster, who once shamed a boastful chief by weaving his arrogance into a web for all to see. No thrones protected these tricksters, their authority came from the land itself. Among the Haida, ravens, foolish, theft of sunlight from the gods wasn't just a myth, it was a cultural blueprint for challenging the status quo. Colonial records even note how indigenous leaders kept contraries. Individuals who dressed backward, spoke in opposites, and like jesters, voiced uncomfortable truths. When a Cherokee contrary named Standing Laughing warned his tribe against selling ancestral land, his methods were pure court fool. He negotiated the treaty while hopping on one foot, shouting that if the tribe believed white men's promises, they might as well believe a man could fly. The deal collapsed in uneasy silence. What binds these diverse roles wasn't costume or continent, but a shared understanding of humor as social glue, and sometimes solvent. Chinese Yuan used poetry where European fools used puppetry. Islamic Mutayaman wrapped heresy in mystic riddles. Native tricksters wielded nature's absurdity instead of a jester's bauble. Yet all recognize that the most effective critique often wears a grin. The Ojibwe say coyote still laughs when humans repeat their follies, a reminder that the fool's mirror reflects universally, whether held up in a Ming dynasty palace or a Mughal courtyard beneath cathedral vaults or towering totems. Buried beneath layers of dirt and time, the physical traces of jesters whisper secrets no chronicle ever recorded. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a Danish castle's latrine made a startling find. A skeleton clad in moth-eaten motley, its neck vertebrae twisted at an unnatural angle. The positioning suggested strangulation, yet the corpse had been carefully laid to rest with a miniature scepter clasped in its hands. Forensic analysis revealed something even stranger. The man's teeth showed signs of deliberate filing, a grotesque mimicry of a jester's grin. This wasn't just a burial, it was a message. Bones don't lie, and these told a story of a fool who pushed too far, immortalized in death as the court's final punchline. Artifacts peel back layers of deception too. Conservators at Warwick Castle recently pried open a centuries-old jester's marot, that iconic staff topped with a fool's head, to discover its hollow core packed with tightly rolled vellum. Unfurled, the scraps revealed a venomous satire of Richard III's reign, complete with caricatures of nobles as braying donkeys. The twist, the marot's face was carved to resemble the king himself, its tongue hinged to wag when shaken. Someone had risked treason to turn the joke back on the monarch, hiding dissent in plain sight. Some discoveries rewrite history entirely. A 2022 dig at France's Château de Langeais uncovered a trove of lead figurines depicting obscene tableaus, kings mid-coupling with pigs, bishops vomiting coins. Initially dismissed as crude toys, scholars realized these were a jester's toolkit, used to act out scandalous allegories too dangerous to speak aloud. The most damning piece, a tiny guillotine with interchangeable heads, allowing the fool to execute different nobles based on audience reaction. These weren't gags, they were psychological weapons wielded in the shadows of candlelight. Manuscripts offer darker glimpses still. Hidden behind a false wall in a Bavarian monastery, researchers found a 15th century fool's chronicle, not an official record, but a coded diary penned by a jester named Markov. Between drinking songs and dirty limericks, he documented court intrigues in lemon juice ink, visible only when held to flame. One entry describes a duke's poisoning framed as a recipe. Take one flatterer's tongue, add a drop of royal suspicion, and stir until the taster stops breathing. The margins brim with tiny sketches of nobles as animals, their species corresponding to known heraldry, visual proof that jesters were the era's most meticulous gossipmongers. Perhaps the most haunting relics are the ones never meant to be found. Beneath Prague's Charles Bridge, laborers repairing flood damage in 2013 stumbled upon a sealed alcove containing 7 Jesters' caps arranged in a circle. Each bore embroidered names now lost to history, their bells crusted with verdigris. At the center lay a single goblet stained with something dark, wine or blood. Local legends speak of a Fool's Guild initiation rite, but the truth may be simpler, a memorial for jesters who vanished when their humor ran dry. These silent artifacts remind us that for all their laughter, these were men who lived and died by the sharpness of their wit. The real revelation isn't what we've uncovered, but what remains hidden. For every jester's skeleton found with bells still clinging to its ribs, there are 100 more lying in unmarked pits, their stories dissolved like the acid once used to scour treasonous jests from palace walls. Archaeology doesn't just excavate objects, it exhumes the weight of silenced voices, proving that history's truest court record wasn't written by scribes, but buried with the fools who dared to speak it. Late-night hosts firing jokes from neon-lit studios might seem worlds apart from jesters whispering truths in torchlit halls, but the DNA of disruption remains startlingly similar. Take Stephen Colbert's infamous 2006 White House Correspondents' Dinner performance. Cloaked in the persona of his bloviating conservative pundit character, he eviscerated George W. Bush to his face while the audience's nervous laughter morphed into stunned silence. The parallels to medieval fools are uncanny, the same calculated risk, the same weaponized absurdity, even the same safety net of plausible deniability. It's just comedy. Yet for all the spectacle, modern comedians lack one critical advantage their ancestors had: immunity. When Trevor Noah criticized authoritarian regimes on The Daily Show, Comedy Central's parent company faced retaliatory advertising boycotts, a far cry from the days when a king's pardon could shield a jester from consequences. Social media has birthed a wilder, more decentralized breed of jesters, meme creators who topple politicians with a single viral image. The Pepe the Frog phenomenon demonstrated this power when the cartoon amphibian became both a hate symbol and a tool to mock extremists, its meaning morphing faster than any censor could track. Like medieval fools encoding rebellion in nursery rhymes, today's anonymous shitposters hide dissent behind layers of irony. When Russian activists photoshopped Putin into increasingly absurd scenarios, from riding a bear to weeping over spilled milk, the Kremlin's attempts to prosecute them only amplified the jokes. This is court fool tactics at digital scale, ridicule as a solvent for authority, laughter as the ultimate unblockable VPN. Yet crucial differences emerge. Medieval jesters operated within a system that officially sanctioned their role, while modern satirists exist in a legal gray zone. A Saudi meme creator faces prison for mocking the crown prince. A Chinese blogger disappears for parodying Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh. Even in democracies, algorithms now act as digital lords chamberlains, shadow banning or demonetizing subversive content under vague community guidelines. The jester's historical privilege, that sacred right to provoke without punishment, hasn't translated to the digital town square. Corporations have co-opted the fool's mantle too, with diminishing returns. Brands attempting wokeness often trip over their own motley, like Pepsi's infamous protest ad featuring Kendall Jenner. These hollow gestures lack the visceral risk that gave historical jesters their power. No marketing director will lose their head over a tone-deaf tweet. Meanwhile, genuine corporate whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden face persecution far harsher than any medieval jester's banishment, proving that real truth-tellers still pay a brutal price. The most compelling modern heirs might be guerrilla artists like Banksy, whose shredded painting stunt at auction mirrored the jester's flair for symbolic disruption. Or protesters adopting absurdist tactics like the Czech activists who dressed as giant playing cards to mock their corrupt government. These inheritors understand the oldest rule of foolery. When power flexes its muscles, sometimes the strongest rebuttal is a belly laugh. But perhaps the purest evolution is found in places where jesters are still needed, most like Belarus clown protests, where citizens marched with rubber chickens to satirize their dictator's brutality. When riot police hesitated to arrest performers in red noses, the world witnessed a glimmer of that ancient magic, the momentary hesitation of authority faced with ridicule. The difference: today's fools buy their own costumes, improvise their own immunity, and rarely live to collect a pension. The bells may now be encrypted emojis and the baubles viral hashtags, but the war between laughter and tyranny remains the same endless chess game. Only now the pawns are posting memes. Centuries may have silenced the jesters' bells, but their legacy rings louder than ever, not in the grand halls of kings, but in every corner of modern life where laughter dismantles power. These medieval truth-tellers were more than entertainers. They were revolutionaries in motley, proving that humor could be the ultimate Trojan horse for dissent. From Shakespeare's fools to today's satirical late-night hosts, the DNA of the jester lives on in those who wield wit as both mirror and scalpel, exposing hypocrisy while the crowd still claps. Their greatest trick: making tyranny ridiculous, one punchline at a time. Consider how their tactics evolved. The court jesters' coded rhymes now thrive in viral memes mocking politicians. Their hollow baubles, once hiding secret messages, have become encrypted chat rooms where activists coordinate. Even their immunity survives, not as royal decree, but as the fleeting protection of a trending hashtag or the anonymity of a pseudonym. The stakes, though, remain terrifyingly familiar. Where jesters risk the gallows, modern truth-tellers face doxing, lawsuits, or worse. Yet the game persists because the need hasn't changed. Every era gets the fools it deserves, and ours are just as willing to dance on the knife's edge. So who wears the motley today? Look to the whistleblowers leaking secrets behind cartoon avatars, the stand-up comedians turning police brutality into biting satire, even the teenagers stitching TikTok skits about climate denial. They're all heirs to the jester's throne, trading bells for Wi-Fi but keeping the same mission: to speak truth where others fear to tread. The difference: today's fools aren't confined to courts. They're everywhere, from subway platforms to Silicon Valley boardrooms, armed with irony instead of scepters. As the torch passes, one question lingers: will we recognize their value before it's too late? History remembers jesters as comic relief, but their real gift was making power uncomfortable enough to change. In a world drowning in misinformation and performative outrage, we need these modern fools more than ever, not just to make us laugh, but to remind us that sometimes the most profound truths come dressed as jokes. Now it's your turn. Which jester's story shocked or inspired you most? Drop a comment below with your favorite medieval fool fact, or hit subscribe to join us as we keep unearthing history's most daring secrets, one scandal at a time. The court of public opinion awaits, and like any good jester, we're just getting started.